Dynamic SQL is one of those little programming functionalities that will really come in handy very quickly once you start digging into the use of variables and parameters in your SQL programming. So what exactly is Dynamic SQL? Well, here's a good question for you. Is it SQL code with an effervescent personality and a real vigor for performing so as to exceed the client expectations? Well, not exactly. You kind of thought you were in the sales marketing meeting there, didn't you? Dynamic SQL has to do with how we use variables. And as you remember, when we talked about adding input parameters and using variables in our stored procedures, it really added a lot of power to them. And so using parameters and variables gives Transact SQL incredible flexibility and power, and you can really write some code that does some really magical things. The values can then be supplied dynamically as the code runs. And we can look at conditional aspects with the code, change the variables, and so forth. You're going to quickly run into a slight issue with variables before you program too long, because inevitably you're going to come up with an idea that just won't work, because there are a few places out there in Transact SQL where variables simply cannot be substituted for literal values. We're talking about things like database name in the use statement, table names in the from clause. So I cannot just with straight up Transact SQL, variabilize the table name so I can execute the same select query for multiple tables. And I'm going to show you an example of that later on in the course. I also can't use Dynamic SQL for column names in the select clause or the where clause or the group by or having clause, and I can't use variables in the order by. But there are a lot of times when I really need to do just exactly that. The contents of a list like in, when we're using the keyword in and we're like dynamically building a list, can't use variables within those parentheses after in. So what is Dynamic SQL? Now that you know what it's going to solve, it is really a programming technique that allows the query to not be carried through the same procedural steps as just straight regular Transact SQL. It allows the query to be handled by the compiler in a different manner. And the technical way to say this is it allows variables to be used for many literals that cannot be done using standard form T-SQL. It causes that statement to be built dynamically at runtime. In other words, it makes the statement itself get built and treated just like a variable does. Now we're going to look at some code examples in a video entitled Dynamic SQL Examples. And the best way to understand this, like most things in code, is just to see it happen. So that's what we're going to do. So in this video, I've just kind of given you the heads up on what Dynamic SQL is. For now, just understand it's a programming technique. Join me in the video Dynamic SQL Examples, and you'll see that programming technique, and it won't take very much for the light to come on, and you're going to see a lot of uses for this particular programming technique, Dynamic SQL.